For 2 weeks her dogs kept doing the same strange thing. They slipped out at dusk, went to the exact same line of trees and came back smelling like metal and wet dirt, like something they didn't want to carry home. They weren't hunting. They weren't playing. They were watching. Then one night, one of them came back limping. And the next morning, she realized they weren't acting scared. They were acting like they were guarding her from something they had already found. So she called a police officer friend, and when he followed them into the forest, the dog stopped at a clearing and refused to go any farther. Before we start, please subscribe. When we hit 100,000 subscribers, I'll be buying a dog I truly admire, a Tibetan Mastiff. Let me know in the comment, do I have bad taste, or is that a solid choice? For years, the woman had lived the same way, quietly and without interruption. Her house sat where the forest thickened, far enough from the road that passing cars were rare and voices almost never carried. The days followed familiar shapes. Morning light through the kitchen window, the sound of water heating, her 2 dogs moving through the house as if they knew every floorboard by heart. Nothing ever surprised her out there, and that was exactly why she stayed. The dogs had always been calm, not lazy, not dull, just settled. They slept when the house slept, watched the trees without urgency, and only barked when something truly crossed into their space. That was why the change unsettled her so deeply. It began so quietly that she almost missed it. One evening, just before dusk, she noticed the back door wasn't fully latched. She remembered closing it. She always did. One of the dogs stood near the doorway, ears angled toward the forest, body still in a way that felt deliberate. The other paced once, then stopped beside it, both of them facing the same direction, noses lifting slightly as if the air itself was speaking to them. She called their names. They didn't move. A moment later, they slipped outside together, not running, not sneaking, just moving with purpose. She expected them to circle back within minutes the way they always had. They didn't. When they returned nearly half an hour later, their coats were damp, their breathing steady, and there was a smell she couldn't place clinging faintly to them. Not rot, not blood, something heavier, something metallic beneath the forest damp. She told herself it was nothing. Animals wandered, scents carried. The woods were full of things she didn't see. The next night it happened again. This time she watched from the kitchen window as they moved through the trees, stopping at the same edge of the forest as before. They didn't bark wildly. They barked in short, sharp bursts, focused, aimed at a place where nothing appeared to be. Their bodies stayed tight, alert, angled protectively toward the house behind them. She stepped onto the porch and called them back. They returned immediately, but not before casting one last look toward the trees, as if marking something they expected to still be there later. Over the next few days, the pattern settled in. The dogs began using the back door on their own, slipping out at nearly the same time each evening, sometimes in the early morning, sometimes just before night fully fell, always together, always toward the same side of the forest. Sometimes they were gone for 10 minutes, sometimes for 30, once nearly an hour. They came back changed each time, not injured, not frantic, just wrong. Their movements grew sharper, they slept lighter. One of them began positioning itself between her and the back door whenever she moved through the house at night. The other watched the windows more than the woods now, tracking sounds she couldn't hear. And always that smell returned with them, faint but persistent. Something they carried in their fur and on their breath. She tried to explain it away. They were hunting, she thought, or scavenging. Animals did that. Dogs still carried old instincts no matter how well fed they were. She lived too far from people for anything else to make sense. No neighbors, no footpaths, no reason for anyone to be out there. Still, she started counting the hours more carefully. She noticed how they left without hesitation, as if responding to something timed. How they never chased birds or deer on those trips. How they returned alert instead of satisfied. She noticed how one dog licked its paws obsessively after coming back one night, as if trying to remove a taste it didn't want to keep. Once, she found a dark smear on the back step, not enough to identify. Gone by morning after rain. She stood there longer than she meant to, staring at the wood grain as if it might tell her what she wasn't ready to know. The dogs sensed her attention shifting. They stayed closer to her indoors, pressing their bodies against her legs when she sat, sleeping nearer to her bedroom door instead of the hallway. When she reached for them, they leaned in fully, not restless, not distracted, just present, as if guarding her was now part of whatever they had decided needed guarding. By the end of the second week, the quiet of the forest felt different. The sounds hadn't changed, but her awareness had. Every rustle carried weight. Every pause felt intentional. The dogs no longer waited for her routines to guide them. They were following something older, sharper, something that didn't care whether she understood it yet. She stood at the back door one evening, hand on the handle, watching the trees where the dogs always stopped. For the first time since it began, she wondered not what the dogs were finding out there, but what they had already seen. By the time the third week began, the woman stopped pretending the pattern would fade on its own. The dogs still ate when she fed them, still drank, still slept, but everything about how they did those things had changed. They no longer collapsed into rest. They settled in short stretches, waking often, heads lifting at sounds that never reached her ears. One of them began eating quickly, then stepping away from the bowl to watch the back of the house, as if food was something to finish before returning to duty. She told herself they were reacting to wildlife. Coyotes, maybe, or a bear moving through the deeper part of the forest. That explanation fit the place she lived, the isolation she had chosen. It did not explain why the dogs always went to the same direction, the same invisible line in the trees, or why they never chased anything once they reached it. One afternoon, when they returned earlier than usual, she noticed the first wound. It was small, easy to miss at first, hidden beneath thick fur along one dog's shoulder. When her hand brushed over it, the dog stiffened but did not pull away. She parted the fur carefully and saw a shallow cut, not fresh, already beginning to scab. It did not look like a bite. It looked like a scrape, the kind that came from something sharp and fixed, not alive. Branches, she murmured to herself. Thorns, she cleaned it anyway. She brought warm water and a cloth, moved slowly, spoke softly the way she always had when they were hurt as puppies. The dog watched her closely, muscles tense, but it trusted her enough to stay still. When she finished, it leaned into her touch just briefly, then pulled back and turned its head toward the forest again, but that night, the smell was stronger. It clung to them when they came back, enough that she noticed it the moment they stepped inside. She opened a window without realizing she was doing it. The air helped, but not enough to quiet the thought that settled into her chest and stayed there. She fed them early that evening, hoping full stomachs might keep them inside. They ate, but neither relaxed. One of them paced between the kitchen and the back door, stopping each time to listen, body angled as if measuring distance. The other sat near her chair, back straight, eyes flicking between her face and the darkening window. When they finally slipped outside again, she didn't stop them. Instead, she watched. She stood at the edge of the yard, just far enough to see their shapes move through the trees. They did not play. They did not explore. They walked straight to the same place and stopped. She heard the barking then, sharper than before, not loud but insistent, aimed into the forest like a warning spoken again and again. She waited for them to come back. When they did, nearly 40 minutes later, one of them limped. It was subtle, more hesitation than pain, but it was there. She guided them inside immediately, closed the door, locked it without thinking. She knelt on the floor and checked their legs, their paws, their bellies. No blood, no broken skin she could see. Just stiffness, tension, and eyes that refused to meet hers for long. That was when she noticed their mouths. Not bloodied, not stained, just wrong. There was a smell on their breath that made her pull back slightly before she caught herself. It wasn't fresh. It didn't decay. It was something processed, altered, not something that belonged to living forest animals. She cleaned them again, wiped their paws, checked their teeth. She did not ask questions out loud because saying them would make them real. That night she barely slept. Every sound pulled her awake. Every shift of the dogs' bodies sent a spike of alertness through her. When she reached out in the dark, both dogs were already awake, pressed close, their bodies forming a barrier she had never taught them to make. The next morning, she made a decision she had been avoiding. She called her friend. He was a police officer who sometimes stopped by on his days off, usually with coffee, sometimes just to check on her the way people did when someone lived alone that far out. She tried to sound casual when she spoke, tried to laugh when she mentioned the dog's strange behavior. "They keep going into the woods," she said. "Same place, same time, they come back smelling like something they shouldn't." There was a pause on the line. "What kind of something?" he asked. She hesitated. "I don't know," she said, and hated how small that sounded. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't tell her dogs were just dogs. He asked questions instead. How long had it been happening? Whether the dogs were injured? Whether anyone else had access to her land? When he said he would come by the next day, relief hit her harder than she expected. She hung up and looked down at the dogs, who had been watching her the entire call. One of them stepped closer, pressing its head lightly against her knee, not for comfort, but as if acknowledging something had finally shifted. The officer arrived just after midday, his car crunching softly over the gravel drive like it always did. Nothing about his presence felt urgent at first. No sirens, no uniform, just a familiar face stepping out with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and an easy smile that faded the moment he saw the dogs. They did not bark when he approached. They stood. Not rigid, not aggressive, but alert in a way that made him slow his steps without realizing why. One positioned itself slightly in front of the woman, angled so it could see both the man and the tree line behind the house. The other stayed closer to the back door, head lifted, ears tuned toward the forest. "Well," he said lightly, then stopped. "That's new. They've been like this for weeks," she replied. "Always watching, always waiting." He nodded, eyes still on the dogs. "Mind if we take a walk?" he asked, careful with his tone. "Just to see what they're reacting to." She hesitated, then shook her head. "I'd rather come too." He considered that for a moment, then agreed. They didn't leash the dogs. There didn't seem to be a point. The dogs moved ahead on their own, setting a pace that was deliberate but not rushed, following a path that had clearly been used before. Leaves were pressed flat in places. Small branches bent aside, not broken, like something larger than deer had passed through more than once. As they moved deeper into the trees, the air changed. It grew heavier, damp in a way that didn't come from rain. The dogs slowed, noses low now, tails stiff. One of them stopped suddenly and looked back at the woman, holding her gaze until she nodded once. They continued. The officer's posture shifted without him saying anything. His steps grew quieter. His hand brushed his jacket out of habit, checking where his radio would be if he had one. He crouched at one point to examine the ground, fingers hovering just above the mud. "These tracks," he said quietly. "They're not animals." She felt her stomach tight. "People?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. The dogs reached the edge of a clearing and stopped. They didn't go forward. They didn't bark. They stood shoulder to shoulder, bodies angled outward, creating a line she instinctively knew not to cross yet. The officer stepped up beside them, scanning slowly, methodically. The first thing he saw were bones. Not scattered wildly, placed, cleaned of most flesh, pale against dark soil. Nearby, scraps of fur clung to low branches. There were stains on the ground that the rain had tried and failed to erase. A smell lingered there too, sharp and wrong, something that did not belong in any forest. The woman took a step back, breath catching in her throat. "Oh God," she whispered. The dogs did not react to her fear. They stayed focused, eyes tracking the edges of the clearing, the paths leading in and out. One let out a low sound, barely audible, not a growl but a warning. The officer exhaled slowly. "You stay here," he said, voice steady but tight. "Don't move." He stepped forward alone, scanning more carefully now. He spotted what the dogs had been smelling for weeks, what they had been trying to tell her without words. There were drag marks, not deep but repeated, footprints pressed into softer ground, signs of work done quickly, carelessly, and often. "This isn't a one-time thing," he said under his breath. He backed away and pulled out his phone, dialing as he moved. His voice dropped when the call connected. He spoke in short sentences, clipped and precise, the way people do when they need to be understood the first time. When he hung up, he turned to her. I need backup, he said. This is bigger than I thought. She nodded, too numb to argue. The dogs shifted then, pressing closer to her sides, not touching but forming a barrier again. She rested her hands lightly on their backs, feeling the tension beneath their fur, the readiness that had never truly left them. They waited. Time stretched strangely in the clearing. Minutes felt longer. Every sound seemed amplified. A bird taking flight, leaves rustling in a breeze she hadn't noticed before. The dogs tracked it all, heads moving in unison. When the first police vehicles arrived, the dogs reacted immediately. They didn't bolt. They didn't panic. They moved closer to the woman, watching the officers step out, reading body language the way they always had. The officer who had come with her spoke quickly, briefing the others, pointing out the ground, the bones, the paths. More vehicles followed. By the time it was done, 6 officers stood in the clearing, their expressions grim, their movements careful. 2 brought their own dogs, trained, alert, noses already working the air. One of the handlers paused when he saw the woman's dogs. "Yours?" he asked. "The reason we're here," she replied. The handler watched as her dogs moved forward just enough to indicate the trail they had followed for weeks, then stopped, waiting. His own dog picked up the scent immediately, tail stiffening, body aligning with the direction indicated. "Well," he murmured, impressed. "Looks like they've been doing our job for us." They moved as a group this time, but the dogs stayed in front, setting the pace in a way no one argued with. The officers did not rush them. The handlers watched closely, reading the same thing the woman had learned to read over 2 weeks of unease, the way the dogs paused before certain bends, the way they avoided one path and chose another, the way their bodies tightened not with fear but with certainty. The forest seemed to close in as they went deeper. The light thinned, filtered through thicker branches, and the ground grew softer underfoot. The dogs slowed near a narrow trail that cut away from the clearing, barely visible unless you already knew to look for it. Leaves had been brushed aside too many times to be natural. The smell was stronger here, old and sharp, carried low along the ground. One of the officers crouched, touching the soil with gloved fingers. "This path gets used," he said quietly. "A lot." The dogs confirmed it without sound. One stepped forward, then stopped, head lifting, nose working the air. The other shifted closer to the woman again, placing itself between her and the trail ahead, as if measuring how much farther she should be allowed to go. "I'm okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was reassuring. They followed the path until the trees opened just enough to reveal something that did not belong there. Not a building, not exactly, but structures made from what was easy and temporary. Tarps stretched between trees, wooden frames leaned together, the ground beneath them darkened and worn flat. Nothing polished, nothing permanent, just enough to do what needed to be done and disappear if necessary. The officers spread out slowly, careful with their steps. No one spoke loudly. Radios stayed quiet. Even the trained police dogs lowered their movements, mirroring the behavior of the woman's dogs as if taking cues from them. There were more remains here, not arranged this time, not hidden well. Bones, scraps, stains that told the story without needing detail. Hooks fashioned from bent metal hung from a beam. A table, rough and scarred, stood off to one side. The smell clung to everything, a mixture of blood, rust, and rot that made the woman's throat tighten. She turned away instinctively, and her dogs responded at once, stepping closer, blocking her view, their bodies firm and steady like they had rehearsed it. One of the officers swallowed hard. "This isn't random," he said. "This is organized." Another nodded, scanning the area. "And recent." The woman's dogs moved again, this time not toward the center but around the edges. They followed the perimeter, noses low, tails stiff, marking invisible lines in the dirt. One stopped near a cluster of trees and sat, staring at a patch of ground where the leaves were disturbed differently, where something heavy had been dragged and loaded. A truck track cut faintly through the mud. The officer who had first come with her stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "They're taking them out from here," he said, "in pieces." No one corrected him. No one needed to. One of the handlers checked his watch and then his phone. "We've had reports," he said slowly. Dogs going missing, different parishes, different weeks. Nothing connecting them except the fact that no one ever found where they went. The woman felt cold spread through her chest. "My dogs," she said quietly, "they always barked toward this place, always came back smelling like this." The handler looked at them with something close to respect. "They heard it," he said. "They smelled it. They knew." The police dogs were working now too, tracing trails away from the site, deeper into the forest and toward a dirt road beyond the trees. One officer raised a hand, signaling a halt when he reached the edge of the clearing again. "We don't push farther today," he said, "not without the right people." The decision was made quickly after that. Photos were taken, coordinates logged. The area was marked carefully, discreetly. No tape flapping in the wind, no obvious signs that would warn anyone watching from a distance. The woman stayed where she was, hands resting on her dogs, feeling their breathing slow as the tension shifted. They were still alert, but something had changed. They had led the humans to the truth they had been circling for weeks. As they began the walk back, one officer fell into step beside her. "You did the right thing," he said. She shook her head gently. "They did," she replied, glancing down at the dogs. The officer followed her gaze and nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "They did." By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the light had changed again, the afternoon settling in, ordinary and almost peaceful in a way that felt wrong after what they had seen. The dogs paused once more at the tree line, looking back toward the hidden site, memorizing it. That was the part the woman remembered most clearly later, how nothing changed at first. The forest stayed still. The back door stayed quiet. Her dogs slept more deeply than they had in weeks, stretched out on the floor like their bodies had finally been allowed to let go of something they had been carrying alone. If she hadn't known what waited beyond the trees, she might have believed it was over already. It wasn't. The arrests did not happen the same day, and they did not happen loudly. The officers came back twice that week, always in unmarked cars, always calm, asking careful questions. They never brought uniforms into her home. They never raised their voices. They listened when she spoke about the dogs slipping out, about the barking, about the smells she hadn't understood. They wrote everything down, not because it was evidence in the usual sense, but because it explained timing, patterns, intent. The dogs were present for all of it. They didn't hover, didn't interfere, but they stayed close, choosing positions that let them see every entrance at once. One lay near her feet. The other stayed angled toward the back door. The officers noticed but didn't comment. Some things didn't need to be pointed out to be respected. By the end of the week, she learned what her dogs had found. It wasn't a single act. It was a system. A small group, 6 men in total, had been stealing dogs from neighboring parishes for months, sometimes longer. They targeted places where animals were less likely to be tracked quickly: rural homes, isolated properties, older owners. They moved often, changed routes, dismantled sites as soon as attention grew too close. The clearing in the forest wasn't their first location. It was just the one her dogs had refused to ignore. The officers didn't describe everything they found. They didn't need to. What they did tell her was enough. The reports of missing dogs that had never connected before now fit together cleanly. Physical evidence matched timelines. Tire tracks matched known vehicles. Witness accounts that had once sounded unreliable made sense in context. The case moved faster than anyone expected once it was clear. When the arrests came, they were quiet too. No sirens tearing through the woods. No shouting at dawn. The men were taken separately, at different locations, so none of them had time to warn the others. By the time the news reached the local station, all 6 were already in custody. The trial came later. She did not attend every day. She did not need to. The officers kept her informed in simple terms. The evidence held. The pattern was undeniable. The sentences were long, 30 years each, not because of one crime, but because of many, stacked carefully and deliberately, the way justice sometimes arrives when patience outlasts cruelty. When it was over, there was no press conference. There were no headlines about brave dogs or heroic discoveries. The case appeared briefly in regional news, a paragraph here, a mention there. People reacted quietly, shaking their heads, holding their own dogs closer at night. Then life moved on as it usually did. At her house, nothing changed. The dogs still used the back door, but they no longer slipped out in silence. They no longer barked toward the forest. They slept through the night without waking at every sound. The restless pacing faded. The alert tension softened into something closer to peace. One afternoon, the officer who had first walked with them returned, not in uniform, not with a notebook, just with time. He crouched in the yard and let the dogs approach him on their terms. When one pressed its nose briefly against his knee, he smiled and looked up at her. "They did something important," he said. "You know that, right?" She nodded. "They were just doing what they knew." He hesitated, then added, "They solved in weeks what we couldn't in months." She looked down at them then, really looked. At the way they moved now without urgency. At the way they trusted the quiet again. "They warned," she said softly. "Someone just finally listened." When the officer left, the dogs followed her inside and settled where they always did. The house felt the same as it had before the strange weeks began. The kettle whistled. The floor creaked. The forest beyond the trees stayed distant and still. At night, she sometimes stood by the back door and looked out, not in fear but in understanding. She knew now what her dogs had carried alone, how they had stood between her and something she never saw coming. They had not chased danger. They had guarded their home. And once that work was finished, they returned to her side, content to live the same quiet life they had always chosen, in a place where they were trusted enough to be believed.